It's impossible to consider the options for Canada in future relations with either China or the US without understanding this big picture. We're in the midst of a global transition in which the two great powers contest both interests and values. And the US specifically, the global hegemon, is seeking to curb the rise of China as the leading power in Asia. President Biden has extended the economic measures introduced by President Trump, and the intense rivalry between the great powers merely depletes the international oxygen available to other powers to pursue their interests. China is already the engine of regional economic growth and integration, and the largest trading partner of each country and the anchor in most Asian supply chains. The US isn't even a member of either RCEP or the CPTPP, the two regional trade groupings, and Asia is widely expected to generate the majority of global GDP over the coming decades. But on the other hand, the US has strong treaty relationships with the leading states of the region of Asia, and its decoupling strategy in high tech is unquestionably a major challenge to China. Militarily, the US ability to prevail in Asia is no longer absolute. China's aerial denial missile strategies make active engagement risky, highly risky. The US-China rivalry in Asia may well not result in any clear-cut victory for the United States. So given these real power deficits, the US has forged a soft power coalition, the Democracy 10, G7 plus South Korea, Australia, and India. Initiatives include efforts to weaken China's regional role and legitimacy at its borders. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, it's all focused on this. Hobbling its innovation, China's innovation in advanced tech, reducing its influence in global institutions, and constraining efforts to modify liberal HR norms. The US effort to rally treaty partners is powerful, but having mixed results. Asian and European leaders both seek to provide verbal support to the Americans while minimizing the damage to their bilateral relationships with China. And most seek an outside power to counterbalance China in the region, but not to destabilize and confront the region. Each power has its own coalition priorities. For Australia, it's the US support in resisting China's trade coercion. For Japan, it's continued US military support in the Pacific. For the EU, it's US support for WTO reform. For Canada, it's the withdrawal of the Meng extradition request or some solution to the issue. But the Achilles heel for the US leadership of the coalition is President Biden's domestic political situation. The Republicans seek to out-hawk the Democrats on China at every turn, especially in the run-up to the 2022 elections. President Biden has no room for maneuver. He is unable to expend the political capital necessary to deliver on allied priorities. Also, the biggest headache for the allies is the possibility of a Republican president in 2024, resulting in a dramatic realignment of America's international direction. As time passes, these factors will affect the willingness of allies to support requested US missions. Canada must also consider the severe damage to critical domestic interests when we act on US requests without sufficient attention to first protecting our own interests. These, to the extent that it's possible in the situation. These include the request to extradite Madam Meng, the massive cost to the Canadian telecom industry, government and consumers in eventual G5 implementation, resulting from the switch to the few other global producers of G5 equipment, and the damage to Canada's, perhaps most importantly, the damage to Canada's innovation infrastructure as US government aims to push Chinese researchers out of global high-tech innovation and manufacturing ecosystems, winnowing out Chinese scientists and PhD students on grounds of connections to Chinese government and and their large corporations, state-owned enterprises. These are key issues which we may have to discuss, we may have the time to discuss later. Regardless of efforts to constrain and isolate it, China will become the largest global economy within the decade, whether Western or not. Small and medium-sized countries and advanced and emerging markets alike have core economic interests engaged with China, and this will continue to be a critical priority for them. This will eventually be true of Canada, although surveys suggest Canadians remain reluctant to recognize our position as a Pacific nation, preferring to look south and east as we have always done. This tendency is exacerbated by discomfort with China and lack of familiarity with Asia in general. We may have to experience slowing economic performance before we see changes in Canadian attitudes. If the US Democratic coalition serves primarily to heighten geopolitical tensions without delivering needed benefits, the partners may well shift their focus towards collaborating with like-minded states on a raft of needed international agreements and standard setting. Our deep immersion in US mainstream and social media embeds us in the US perception of its national interest. As a privileged neighbor, we're accustomed to thinking we have similar interests to the US. We now need to formulate an independent view of when and how our interests diverge under great power competition. We have long sheltered in the advantages of the US dominance and are now exposed to its drawbacks. It's time to take responsibility for our own core interests, recognizing our responsibilities to the United States, but aware and focused with respect to our own interests. Canada is treated as a minor power by both the United States and China. Minor power status is when a major power neither consults nor accommodates. We're certainly a minor power to China. We're not in their region. We're within the close embrace of the United States. We're not irrelevant, but we're not permitted to flout China's core interests without consequences, which is what we're undergoing. Some examples of the US failure to accommodate our interests include the steel and aluminum tariffs, forced renegotiation of NAFTA, the vassal state language inserted at the 11th hour in the USMCA agreement, giving US veto power over any future Canadian trade deal with China, no help on Madam Meng, or the Michigan Pipeline Treaty violations. In light of this, Canada must adapt to its very narrow room for maneuver. First and foremost, we must avoid damaging and unforced errors, such as arresting Madam Meng, by anticipating the interests and the moves of both China and the US. We need to focus on our essential interests and only our essential interests, and devote the necessary resources to realizing them. Clearly, this is limited, and a deeply pragmatic approach would represent a major change in our mindset, which is typically oriented towards principles. Canada's interest in the evolution of a peaceful, multipolar international order, that's our interest. Finding ways to mitigate the collateral damage of great power rivalry means working with like-minded powers, especially in East Asia and Europe. Our credibility will depend on being an independent and insightful participant, promoting the participation of both China and the United States in the global issues important to us. Standards in data and technology regulations, cybersecurity, global health, space, etc. Climate change, obviously. The path towards a multipolar order seems closed at the moment, but it could open as the practical implications of a global trade and technological divide, which is what we're looking at now, and increased military tensions become clearer to the world.